Well, hello. I've been asked to talk about doing talks on face blindness, and I should explain that this isn't something that I ever planned to do. It started back in 2006 when I was diagnosed at UCL, and at that time the leader of the team there was Brad Duchesne, and they were looking for a grant to test children. And they were all American. And I did wonder when I heard about this, whether they really realised the difficulties of dealing with the English education system. I just retired from working in further education, so I had a reasonable idea of it. And I knew that they were going to have to engage with an education authority and persuade them that they would really like to come and test their 5-year-olds or 7-year-olds about a condition that no one had ever heard of. And when you think that just in Greater London there are 32 separate education authorities, it seemed to me they might have a problem. So, having only just retired, I'd still got contacts in education, and I thought it might be useful if I were to talk to a few people, see if I was right in thinking that no one had ever heard of it. And I went to my own borough, which was Bexley, and after a bit of negotiation, I got a whole 5 minutes at a Senko training day. Well, you can't do much in 5 minutes, not with an unknown subject. But that turned out to be very useful because when I approached the next borough, I could say, well, I have talked to your colleagues at Bexley, however briefly, and that worked quite well because they think if someone else has had it, they want it, and particularly when it's free. So over the next 2 or 3 years, I was able to do talks at Senko training sessions in about 2/3 of the London boroughs. And altogether, that added up to about 800 special needs teachers. Out of that lot, I found around half a dozen who had ever heard of it. And those few thought that it was very rare, it was something they'd read about at college in a textbook. They never expected to meet anyone who had it. So when I started talking about 1 child in 50, they started taking notice. Well, after 2 or 3 years of that, I was running out of boroughs. The ones that didn't want me were obviously never going to want me. So I moved on. And I got into the general speakers circuit. And in a way, this was much easier because with the authorities, I had to start from scratch every single time because I was coming in off the street, as it were. I'd got no credentials. They didn't know what I was talking about. I'm quite surprised looking back that I got into as many places as I did. But with this, it's the general speakers circuit. And it was far easier because I was just joining a system, regardless of what I was talking about, that was already set up. I started with the U3A because I belong to that and I know how they work. Then I thought I'd better tackle the Women's Institute. That's a little bit more complicated because to get on a speakers list for the WI, you have to do an audition, which sounds a bit daunting, but in fact, it's no more difficult to do a talk to 40 people who have all come from different WIs than 40 people who all belong to the same one. And I realised later that their system was very useful to me because you can't put over the concept of face blindness in the title of a talk. I do other talks now, and I do one called Odd Corners of London. If someone finds that in their yearbook, they can ring me up, arrange a date, and they know exactly what they're going to get. You can't do that with face blindness. It all comes by word of mouth recommendation, people who have actually heard it. So the fact that I could have one talk and get 40 people who were then going to go back to their WIs and hopefully say that I think we'd like to hear this one, that really worked well for me. I've done a few other things, Probus, national women's groups, active retirement, and these do tend to be the same kind of group, but it is a matter of using what's available. Most of the places I go to are either village halls or church halls. We did have a rather imposing town hall here that one group met in, and that one is a pavilion right on the beach at Hastings, which was a very nice day out. But generally, it's a village hall somewhere out in the rural lanes of Kent. And the first thing I have to ask when I get there is, do you have a power socket? And do you by any chance know where it is? Sometimes that can take a little while. The audiences are pretty much the same. They're either all women or mainly women, and they are over 60, usually. And you might say that's not a very productive lot to be talking to. It's partly a matter of what's available. These are people who come out every month, they expect to hear a speaker. They don't mind too much what it's about, so long as it's reasonably interesting. And I found that if you can amuse them as well, you can feed as much information as you like on the back of it. And it's also, these are people who've got children and grandchildren in work, and I always make a point of saying that, you know, if you've got a teacher in the family, a social worker, take an extra leaflet, pass it on to them, tell them about it. And I've been doing this general stuff for about 5 or 6 years now, and it's had a very good reception. I can only think of 2 really awkward questions I've had. There was one man who said, if you're face blind, are you more likely to be gay? So I said no, and his wife said, sit down and shut up. So that was him out of the way. The other one was a man who stood up in the back row before I'd had a chance to say, are there any questions? And he waved his arms about a lot and said quite aggressively, what makes you think this condition is any worse than being actually blind? Now, that's the sort of question you hope that the chair is going to deal with for you. But in this case, the chair was asleep, I think, or in a coma. So I was left to come up with some sort of answer. I did point out that I hadn't mentioned being actually blind at any point in the talk, but if he wanted a comparison, at least if someone is really blind, people do tend to notice the fact, and also they understand what it means. But I don't think he was convinced. Earlier this year, I got a very interesting phone call, as I thought, from a local group, National Health Service Retirement Fellowship, meeting at my local hospital. Now, we've had all sorts of discussions about how do we get this into the health service, with no luck at all. So this sounded like really good news. Hazel came to that one with me, because we'd been talking about her coming along sometime. And I started by, as I normally do, asking if people have heard of it before. And these days, in a typical WI group, I'll usually get 2 or 3 hands go up, half a dozen on a good day. When I asked this of a group of 60 retired health workers, they just sat there and looked back at me. There was not one single hand went up. So I'd built a few extra bits into this talk to explain what it's like when you're particularly an inpatient in hospital. And I'd also explained to the group that it would be nice if they had any suggestions of how we could move this forward. At the end of the talk, we did get a few suggestions. One woman said, have you talked to your GPs? Well, Hazel had tried that and not really got very far. Somebody else, who I think had missed the point a bit, said, well, while you're here in the hospital, why don't you go down to A&E and tell them about it? And then when someone comes in with it, they'll know. Yes. But the best one came at the end, while we were clearing up. A woman came up to me looking very intent, and she said, do you find that the eyes are helpful? Well, this was at least a new question, although I had no idea what she was talking about. So she said, well, the eyes are the windows of the soul. I didn't like to ask what she did when she was working for the NHS. I didn't want to know. So that didn't get us much further. Now, leaving actual face-to-face talks for the moment, over the last few years, we've had some success with newspapers, magazine articles, and it's good when it happens, usually. But the trouble with this is that it's not predictable, it's not under our control. We can't either initiate it or control what happens. And you're dependent on a journalist coming across it in the same way that anyone else might and thinking, oh, this would be a great idea for an article, for a programme. And they usually start by ringing around a few people and doing interviews on the phone, and more often than not, that's the last you ever hear of them. When it does go further, there are so many hurdles to overcome, because the journalists may lose interest, if it's a TV programme, they may not be able to get it commissioned, the money they've been promised suddenly goes to someone else. When it does reach the screen or the paper, it can be very useful, because it means that a lot of people get to see it. I mean, compared with, I've talked to about 5,000 people, which in terms of mass media is invisible. But it gets out to a huge number of people, and whichever lab they've contacted will get a lot of people wanting to be tested and diagnosed, so it adds to their data. But it's not something that we can really do a great deal about, except hope that it's useful when it happens. Books, there are a few. Up until 2010, the only stuff was academic articles and Bill Choice's book, which is only online. Then in 2010, we had two come along at once. Heather Sellers, she's a lecturer in the States, and she has a family background with a lot of mental health problems. And until she was in her 40s, she believed that that was her problem as well. Then she found out that, no, she was absolutely fine. She was just face blind. And this one at the top, Nancy, has written, she is also face blind, she's written a handbook for teachers or parents who are dealing with face blind children. I would like to see a copy of that in every school. This one, which Hazel has mentioned, is a collection of stories from all around the world, and there are copies of it over there for sale at a bargain price today. And the ones down the side, that is a set of 3 novels by a woman in Seattle called Jane Mayerding. She has created a character who is both face blind and she has Asperger's. And because those are Jane's conditions as well, it's a very accurate account and very readable. Now, have a look at these and see if you can see the connection between them. We've got a book, a scientific magazine, a Radio 4 programme, a broadsheet paper. That's a display stand at a Royal Society exhibition, and a couple of organisations. Oh, and in the middle is the rather imposing doorway of one of the labs that has done face blind testing. And the connection between those is that these are some of the ways, the most likely ways, that people are going to find out that they are face blind. Not by going to look for it, but simply by using these kind of resources. Some people. Because I think you could reasonably say that these are all rather middle-class resources. We've got a Radio 4 programme. We've got the Daily Telegraph, or joining the U3A. And I would say that probably less than half of the population is ever going to find out about this by these sort of methods, which leaves a huge gap to be filled. I don't know what the answer to that is, but if there are 1.2 million who have it, I would say 2/3 of those need some other way of finding out about it. Have a think for a moment about how you cope with face blindness, going back to the other talks, and you probably go for one route or the other, either the very friendly to everybody just in case, or the rather shy, hide away a bit, don't put yourself about too much in case you make a mistake. And these are things that we have all learnt to do, even before we knew about face blindness. And although it doesn't shield you from all the mistakes, it does mean that you can more or less function in a civilised way, and you don't get into trouble with society as a whole. Now, think if you were a youngish man with an IQ of about 80, and you are severely face blind. You're never going to talk about it. You're probably not going to think up any coping mechanisms. And you're going to have all the confusions and embarrassments and mistakes that we're all used to. And that lad is probably going to have a lot of mates of about the same sort of age and intellectual level. And when he makes mistakes, they are going to tell him about it. And they're going to laugh at him a lot. And after that has gone on for a few times, it's quite likely that he's going to decide the simplest way to sort this one out is to hit somebody, or maybe several. And it's quite possible that he's going to land up in prison if that becomes his coping strategy. And I've no way of proving this at the moment, but I reckon that the incidence of face blindness in prison is going to be a lot higher than 2%. Because it's got a lot of the issues that you've got with the hospital. You've got uniforms, you've got name badges that you can't quite read, or maybe you can't read, because obviously another prison issue is illiteracy. You've got the shift changes. You've also got suddenly being moved at no notice to a different prison in a different county and having to start all over again. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. And Angie and I talked about this some years ago, and we couldn't see any sensible way of getting in. Earlier this year, I was at a meeting where there was an education officer from our local prison. And I had a few words with him, and he was intrigued by it, as people so often are. And he suggested it might be a good idea if I went and talked to their prison staff. We haven't been able to arrange this yet, but I'm still hopeful that it's going to happen. Now, this is a local prison that you won't have heard of called Thameside. But he did say that if it went well, he would recommend me to their big brother next door, which you probably will have heard of, Belmarsh. So there's one to look forward to. You can imagine the sort of situation that would arise in prison, because a hospital at least tries to be caring and sympathetic, and I don't think that's terribly high up the list for prisons. And you could say, well, I told you yesterday, do whatever it was, and then in the morning, come and find me and tell you you've done it. Come and find me out of that lot. But to get back to the things that we can do, it all comes down to communication. And in the 10 years or so that Faceblind has been struggling up the list of people's consciousness, we've had a massive boom in technology and particularly in social media. So we've got Twitter, people's blogs, Facebook, lots of stuff on YouTube, and we all carry around phones that in 10 years ago would have been the equivalent of a computer. So it's really a matter of those of us who know about it getting out there and telling those who don't, because no one else is going to do it for us. So, over to you.